Welcome to the Grief Cocoon podcast, where you'll hear open, honest, and thoughtful conversations on grief and loss, death, and life. In this episode, I speak to Mae Yoshikawa, who's an author, yoga and meditation practitioner, a teacher, and a mother. Mae was really generous with her insights and her stories, and I think this episode will be really useful for anyone who's gone through the gut-wrenching loss of losing either a parent or losing a spouse, and also being a parent while grieving. This episode is also useful for anyone who's interested in yoga and meditation and how it can help the process of grieving. I'm really excited for you to hear this, so let's get straight into it. Yeah, just to begin with, can you please tell me a bit about yourself and what first drew you to the work that you're doing at the moment, the yoga and meditation?
Sure, it's such a delight to meet you. So my name is Mae Yoshikawa, and I live here in Tokyo, Japan, and I was born and raised here. I often say that I look Japanese. I sound like I'm American, but I found my heart in South India, and that kind of encapsulates this mixture that I am. Let's see, where shall I begin? Well, so my mother was half American and half Japanese, and I grew up in this bilingual, bicultural household, and also going to international school here in Tokyo. So even though I'm born and raised in Tokyo, I haven't really been a part of like mainstream, more traditional Japanese culture. And then in my teenage years, my mom and dad got divorced after some 27 years of marriage and 4 kids. I'm the youngest of 4 siblings.
Me too.
Are you really?
Yeah.
Oh, what an interesting commonality.
Yeah.
And it was such a huge shock for me because I was kind of in my pubescent years, right? I think I was 14 going on 15, and it just shattered my world. I didn't know who to trust and what to believe in anymore, what family is and what love is supposed to look like. I was in such a rocky place, you know? And it took me a couple of years to really begin to rediscover myself and to discover my life and what's fun for me and what's good in life and all of these things. But only a couple of short years after the divorce, my mother developed a rare neurological disease where the right hemisphere of her brain started to shrink. And I was 17 and she was only 47 at the time. It was such a rare condition that it took 9 different university hospitals and all these different doctors to come up with a diagnosis, at the end of which they said, let's put atypical Alzheimer type dementia on her charts so that we can begin to prescribe the right medication for her. And this medicine will help to slow down the progress of the disease for the first 2 years. But after that, her handicap and her condition will begin to worsen, and that statistically speaking, we give her 10 more years to live. And we were faced with this diagnosis as I was turning 19, and she was 49, so very, very young. Mm. And, if I look back on that now, I could easily say that that was my first experience of grief. Mm. And now, as I learn more about grief, I'm learning terms like ambiguous loss or gradual loss, and that it's not so black and white. But back then I didn't have the understanding or the clarity or the terminology to begin to describe all of these emotions and thoughts that were going through me. And basically it made me sick. It tortured my mind. All of these, like, why her? Why us? Why this disease? Why now? It made me so sick to the point where I became a depressed insomniac. I realized I needed to do something to get my health together, where it wasn't just going to be my mom's. condition that was going to worsen. And it was from this deep, dark place that I discovered yoga and meditation, which eventually took me to India. So I kept a house in India for some 13 years in South India, studying and furthering the practice of Ashtanga Yoga, where I incidentally became the first Japanese woman to be authorized by the founding school of Ashtanga Yoga in South India. And so, my mom's condition kept changing, but I also, at the same time, began to rediscover my health and my connection to myself and my mind, right? How the way that my mind interprets these events of my life can really make me super depressed, or it can give me hope for the future. And so, and then years later, actually, my mother outlived what the doctors said by another 7 years. So she lived for 17 years since the initial diagnosis, or since the beginning of her disease. And she passed in my mid-30s. But hand in hand with her condition, yoga and meditation became such a central part of my life. And so I began to teach and share this kind of wellness that yoga and meditation has offered to me in my life.
Wow, what an amazing story. And but is yoga and meditation, I guess, common in Japan, or who first introduced you to yoga and meditation?
Yeah, so it's common now, but back when I started, which is 20 some years ago, and that was during my university years, it was not at all common. And a piece of kind of strange Japanese recent history is that in 1995, there was this terrorist attack that happened on the subway system in Tokyo. And it was one of the worst domestic terrorist attacks that's ever happened in Japan. I mean, it's such a peaceful country. And it was carried out by this cult that called themselves Om Shinrikyo cult. And so at the time, there was all of this footage on TV and in the media of people taking like lotus postures and trying to levitate and whatever. It was like this really weird cult. And so yoga, along with this terrorist attack, suffered terrible reputational damage in the late 90s and around 2000. So when I started yoga in 2001, yoga was definitely not a thing in Japan. If anything, I think it was kind of considered like woo-woo, maybe even dangerous and careful so you don't get involved in a cult kind of a thing. I remember when I turned vegetarian, my family, my father, my sister, they were like sincerely worried for me. Like, are you okay, Mae? Like, are you sure you want to go down that road? So no, it was definitely was not popular back when I started. And after all of the research, I found only 3 studios in all of Tokyo metropolitan area that offered yoga. But I had the sense that whatever I was going to do for my health, I would need to continue as a consistent practice. It can't just be like a one-off thing. So I found this studio that was relatively close to my house at the time. I could take my bicycle there. And this teacher had studied from American teachers as well as Indian teachers. So he had a very authentic and traditional method to teaching his yoga, which wasn't only physical, but he definitely introduced like all of the breathing practices and the meditative practices along with the physical aspect, which was a total game changer for me, because I walked in there thinking that health was about my body. But in fact, the symptoms that I was suffering were about depression and insomnia. These are equally emotional and psychological as they are physical. And so when he started to instruct me with a method that united evenness of breath and equanimity of mind, along with the way that I would use my body, then I slept like a baby. And I was like, wow, after all of the other stuff that I tried that didn't work, to just take your body, to just take your breath, and to be able to sleep. I mean, I remember one of the first thoughts I had was that, wow, this works. And I just kept going back.
Wow. And obviously, you've never looked back since then.
Well, it was kind of like, I didn't even have all of the textbooks and all of the materials and the studies and stuff. For me, all of that came afterward. But the experiential, visceral evidence of my body, my mind, and my health changing because of something that I was undertaking, like intentionally, right? I was becoming intentional about the way that I breathe. I was becoming intentional about the way that I eat and my posture. And then eventually, it took me a few years, but I became intentional about the way that I think. And I remember in the initial years, because I had this torturous thought in my mind regarding my mom. Why mom? Why her? Why me? Why us? Why this disease? It was so hard that I had this repetitive, torturous thought in my mind. But then I became aware of the thought that I was engaging in my mind. And then I began to think, well, I've been thinking why torturously for 3 years. It's making me sick. It's not making me better. What if I let go of that thought? What if the question wasn't why? What if the question was why not? Why not you? Why not your mom? Would it be okay if it was somebody else's mom? Would it be okay if she were 59 as opposed to 49? Would it be okay if she was 99? It's like, and then it was mind boggling, but it was such an eye opener for me because I had been so fixated in one way of thinking. And somehow all of the breathing and the meditating gave me a little bit of a new outlook, a little bit of a fresh perspective into, well, what if it's actually not what you think? And that's definitely something, even to this day, continues to call me forward, to beckon me to my future. Because what if this isn't at all what you think it is? At least it's not complete. None of us, our life and our reality, none of us live in a completed form. We're constantly evolving, we're constantly changing. And so it began to open me to possibilities as opposed to this world of closed thinking that I had created for myself.
I really love that. And I think that's really helpful as well because I think a lot of people do get stuck in that why me, and why my loved one, why my mom, like you said. And I guess it sounds like once you start to explore those different possibilities, then you can apply that to everything, not just to the grief and the loss, but you can apply that to all sorts of aspects of your life.
Right.
So that's really amazing, and I think it takes a lot of it's like finding that little pocket of hope or possibility, and going into that. So I know that, I guess it sounds like the loss of your mum was very significant for you at that young age. And then as you got older, you found you got married, and you had children, and you have a family. And so I know that part of your story is also having lost your husband in an accident. And I guess it's you can't really compare losses. Every loss is uniquely significant in different ways for each person. But would you like to share a bit about your husband and how that loss affected you?
Right. Yeah. So after having dove into this practice of yoga, I was first married in my mid 20s. And I had this marriage, my first marriage, for some 5 years or so. And my first son was born of my first marriage. And after that, I went through a really difficult divorce. So again, at the time, I had no clue, but in hindsight, I would say that that was also significant grief, a loss of a future that I had envisioned to be a certain way that really turned out not to be what it was. And so after the shock and the devastating loss of that, it really took me a few years to kind of come back on my feet and to want to fall in love again and to want a family again. And in my mid 30s, I met someone and we felt very much perfect for each other. And so I remarried in my mid 30s to this beautiful man. And I was with him for about 2.5 years. We welcomed our second child. And when my second boy was only 5 months old, my husband, one morning he left for work and he was involved in a traffic accident and was killed instantly. So this experience was hugely shocking, not just for me, but for everyone that knew him. He was also an athlete, super healthy, just the picture of like vibrancy. And he cared a lot about his health. He took really good care of himself, and he just had a love of life, you know? And not to mention that we had just welcomed a baby. So he was super excited about the baby and the growing family. We had just moved into a new apartment. He bought us a new car, a new washing machine, a new big king size bed to fit the baby, and you know, all of these things. Like life was just beginning afresh for us when one morning, well, I remember I got a call from the girl. He worked at a gym, at a kickboxing gym, actually, where he was a professional MMA fighter. So he, aside from having these matches every, like a couple of them every year, he kept a side job as a trainer. So he would go to the gym and he had these clients that he would work with. But one morning, the girl at the gym called me and said, you know, your husband, he hasn't arrived yet. You know, and he was always on time. He was always early. So it was just really odd that he wasn't there. Like he would never be late, like let alone a no-show, you know? So of course I frantically started calling like emergency centers and whatever, and to try to find out if anything happened to him. And that's how I learned that he had been involved in an accident. So that like, you know, there are so many different ways that we go through loss. But for me, it happened with tremendous shock. You know, it was just so sudden, so out of the blue. And then one happy, bright, sunshiny morning, I went from doing like my yoga and meditation practice to like calling emergency centers, you know? Yeah.
And I didn't actually realize, I didn't know that your youngest son was only 5 months old. Like, I think,
Yeah.
you know, when you've got a baby as well that you're looking after, that can kind of create an added, an added kind of layer where that child is dependent. You know, you've got dependent children, and at the same time, then you're dealing with this shock.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know you've mentioned that you took an unconventional approach to planning his funeral and grieving, and so I wanted to know actually, like, what about it was unconventional?
Yeah. So I don't know how funerals and these kinds of things are taken care of in other countries and different cultures, because I'm sure that there's a different way that these things are taken care of. But here in Japan, typically, you know, you arrange for a funeral home and they basically have something like a catalog that says, you know, which funeral package do you want to go with? And it just helps to make all of the decision making easier, a lot easier for the grieving family if they haven't been predetermined, right? And so after I had confirmed my husband's death and notified his parents, and I told my son and my family and these things, well, fortunately, the funeral home and the funeral director, I didn't have to shop for that, let's put it that way, because we knew somebody who knew him directly. So it was really easy to ask him, and he was very, very helpful. But he came to my house and basically showed me the catalog that says it's like package A, B, C, or D, like which casket, like, you know, how much money do you want to spend, and, you know, where is it going to take place, and all of these things. And I just looked at this catalog and I couldn't say yes to any of them. Like, my husband was the steaming hot 220-pound heavyweight, super athletic build athlete. Okay, I was like, God forbid we put him in more white lace. He doesn't fit in any of these prefabricated packages. So, but I'm sitting there like this nice little Japanese girl, like I'm supposed to say yes, like I'm supposed to go, but I just couldn't for the life of me say yes to any of these packages. So I looked at the catalog, I looked at the guy's face, and then I looked at his parents. My dad was in the room, and then his father and mother, my mother and father-in-law, were in the room, and they are from this like super conventional kind of like old school Japanese, you know, non-English speaking, non-global minded kind of agriculturalist kind of like people, you know, lineage, the entire lineage. But I just looked at Otosan, the father's face, and I said, I'm sorry, father-in-law, but I really don't think my husband would fit in any of these prefabricated packages. Like, you know, and he kind of looked at me. And I think he sensed my urgency in not being able to say yes to any of this. And he looked at me and he said, it's okay. It's okay, Mae-san. You can proceed however you like to proceed. I understand that you knew him best. You know, at this point in his life, I knew him, I think, better than his parents did, or better than anybody else did, you know? And so he nodded and gave me the yes. And there began the unconventional planning of the funeral of my husband, which included definitely no more white lace. And I mean, so I don't know if they do this in your country, but in Japan, they typically use this like kind of glossy white kind of cloth coverings around the deceased, like in their coffin and, you know, in the funeral hall and all of this stuff. And I was just like, the man doesn't look good in white lace, you know? That's one thing. And then the other thing, as I was planning the funeral, I said, well, I couldn't imagine doing it in like a funeral hall, you know? And again, that would be like another white lace situation. And so I kept saying, not this, not this, not this, not this. And all of my no's created this vacuum in the room until finally there was this man who had originally years ago introduced my husband and me to each other. So he was like a dear mutual friend, and he was the owner of the gym where my husband worked. And after all of the vacuum that all of my no's created, he spoke up and he said, Mae-san, you can use the gym. And so we conducted the 2-day funeral ceremony at the gym where my husband lived and breathed and worked and trained in for years of his life as a fighter, where an elevated ring, like a fighter's ring, takes up more than half of the space. And we took his coffin, and in the center of the ring, that's where we had the funeral. Wow. I didn't want anyone to wear black clothes. because I thought that my husband would think it was morbid as heck. So um, I asked everyone to just come in their ordinary clothes, which seemed to throw off a lot of people, especially like the traditionalists. Like they didn't know what else to wear if they're not supposed to wear black. And I was like, wear whatever you want, you know, wear what you would wear if you were to come and see him alive. That's what I want you to wear, because this is your final farewell, right? I wore his clothes for like 3 days for the whole funeral thing, because I just needed to be enwrapped in his energy. And like I said, I'm this 100-pound pixie thin yogi, right? And he's like this 220-pound like heavyweight guy. So I had these like big baggy hoodies on for like the whole 3 days during the funeral. And not only that, I took a hoodie and gave one to his mom and his sister and like the significant people in our life, so that they could all wear his hoodies like throughout the funeral.
Wow.
Yeah, and then so that's how we carried out the 2-day procession.
And then, and in terms of ceremony, were there any sort of things that the people that he trained or that he trained with kind of contributed to that?
Well, because his body in the coffin was placed in the center of the ring, everyone who came to the funeral to say their final farewell had to climb through the ring ropes. So I don't know if you guys ever watch any like MMA, but typically like there's a coach type of a guy who steps down on the second ring and who lifts the third ring up so that they can like, so that a fighter entering the ring for a fight would like climb through and then kind of like get the whole thing going. So everyone who came to the funeral had to climb through the ring ropes and say farewell. And it was just so dramatic in a sense, almost movie like. But for me, it was all about honoring him, you know, and I didn't want to cut corners about like, you know, let it be cheaper or doing a prefabricated thing or let it be easier, because that would be about my convenience. My primary concern was to do right by him. And I needed to honor him. I needed to respect him. And I needed to keep my eyes open. You know, I wasn't going to go through this blindly in some kind of a numbed half days. And so, yeah, it was a trip that all of like the old grandmas and grandpas and aunties and children and teenagers like that he ever worked with, like everyone climbed through the ring ropes, like bawling, you know, to come and see him.
Wow, that's
So,
I was before I guess had we started talking, I thought, you know, it takes a lot of courage to do something like that because especially in a society and you know when you have people that are more traditional and conservative and might want to do things a certain way, to say no and then to kind of proceed to make your own choices that are not conventional, you know, at that moment is pretty brave. But because I now I realize like that maybe that permission from your, was it, you know, the permission from your, I guess, father-in-law, did that really
yeah.
give you the confidence to go ahead?
Um, you know, it's funny, until you mentioned that, I don't know that I would have considered myself brave or courageous to have made those decisions and to have said no. Because at that moment and in that space, I did the only thing I knew how, was to stay in my integrity, not just for my sake, but for his sake, and to stay in honor and to make decisions in a way that I wouldn't regret, you know? And that way of living started for me when I started yoga, like, you know, decade before that, like 15 years before that. So it's not like it started yesterday, you know, that way of living. And I also know for a fact that that's something I shared with my husband. He, in the way that, like in Japanese, they call it Budo, which is the way of martial arts. You know, it's not just about fighting. It's not just about the sport. It's about the way that you live and breathe your life in integrity, that you keep your eyes open you give your all to the game, to the match, right? So we definitely have that in common. Now, had my father-in-law or mother-in-law presented resistance to my choices, I'm sure that would have made things a lot more difficult for me. But they gave birth to him, they raised him, and they also knew enough to know that he left his hometown in the countryside to come to Tokyo and to become a fighter, right? So they knew him well enough to know something about his spirit. And so there was definitely respect about that. Yeah,
that's amazing. And I guess, you've just talked about the funeral, but I was wondering, because I don't know much about, I guess, the culture around death or grief in Japan, past the funeral, what was the response like from people, including, obviously the people that knew you, but the people that also knew him for you, what was their support, or how was that shown?
Well, so another thing that I have no idea how people in other cultures, how it's done. But in Japan, typically, when people come to the funeral, they bring a beautifully enclosed envelope with like a black and white ribbon on it, and they enclose some money in it. So they give it's definitely a gift giving culture, and particularly when it comes to like weddings and funerals and sometimes like engagements and things like that there's like a giving of cash that's involved. But there's such a whole array of intricate like cultural details with that, including things like, if someone say gives you a gift of $500, then you give them back an object gift of $250. Like you should always give back half, or that kind of a thing, which I felt I didn't want to put myself in that position because I felt like I had enough stress and enough decision making to do. I couldn't put myself in a position where I would have to worry about all of that for however many hundreds of people that came. So I actually asked people to come and not give me any cash gifts, like at the funeral, just to make things more lightweight for me, There were people who brought it anyway, who said, I don't need anything back, but just please let me support you. So there was definitely some of that. And due to the nature of like how sudden it was, there were people that, tried to support me emotionally, and through their presence in different ways. Like the owner of the gym, for example, provided me with the space that I needed. Some people brought food or brought drinks, and some people helped to take care of my children. Yeah. So there was definitely a lot of giving around that. And that's another like unconventional way that I proceeded with it, is that I chose to excuse myself from a lot of like the cultural elements of it too.
And in terms of the perspectives on grief and death in Japan, is it something that's still that's a little bit taboo, or is it openly talked about?
I would say it's definitely hidden. As you're well aware, and your audience knows too, death is everywhere, and grief is a universal human experience. But it seems like it's still kind of a rarity. Like, how some of my friends in India or in Nepal, they grieve and wail out loud for all the world to see. And grief is a communal thing for some cultures. I wouldn't say the same for Japanese culture. I think it's still very much isolated, very much hidden, and treated like it's something that's dark, gloomy, heavy. There are specific days, like I guess for people that follow the Buddhist tradition, like it's like 49 days from the time of death. to like the spirit rises, I guess is how they consider it. And so that's like the first kind of holy silent period. And then for the first year, they respect a kind of solitude and a silence where greeting cards and holidays greetings and things are all excused because there's been a death in the family. There's that kind of a thing too. And then generally in public, you know, as in many cultures, I think talking about death and grief make people uncomfortable. And especially, like for me, it happened in my 30s, right? I lost my spouse in my 30s while I had a baby, you know? And the older boy was 8 years old at the time too. So one of my closest friends, when I told her, and she hopped on a cab rushing from work to come and see me, she told me that in the cab, the whole time she was Googling how to talk to a person in sudden grief, like in acute grief, because she had no clue how to talk to me, you know? She called me and she said, what do you want me to bring? Like, you probably don't want flowers. Like, what do you need? I said, no, I don't want flowers. Flowers are for the deceased. Bring me food, you know?
Yeah.
I was a nursing mom and I needed to eat. And I felt like food would be more grounding for me. So there's just a lot of like a lack of understanding, which is why I so appreciate the kind of work that you do, you know, because even for me, we don't even think about grief until we need to. And then when we do, it's hard, but it's also very opening. It expands us, it opens us to a greater experience of life, not death. The understanding of death experience opens us to a greater experience of life, you know? And I think that's the piece that we need to share sooner rather than later. Yeah.
Totally agree. And that has been my experience as well, you know, that the more I've looked into the grief and the more I've leaned into it and I've done a lot of research and reading, the more I've learned about it and experienced it, the more life I've been able to experience, and the more the bigger the range of like I don't know, emotion and depth I've had in my life. Yeah. So I know that, you know, obviously you'd been practicing yoga and meditation for a while before the loss, and even I think before your mum's loss as well, the loss of your mum. And I was wondering actually, you know, because sometimes when we experience a significant loss for a while, maybe those things fall away and we're sometimes not able to keep doing the things that maybe that bring us enjoyment or that are good for us, because we're just in our own kind of bubble and can't see the light. And so I was wondering whether after your husband's death, whether you naturally continued the yoga and meditation, or was there a period of time where, you know, you had to just stop and then it came back slowly? What was your experience?
Yeah, in my case, I definitely continued because it was like my own sense of clinging to my own life. Like, quite frankly, I felt like I died. I felt like I died with him because I had shared so much of my life and so much of my heart and my family and my everything with him, you know? And in a sense, it's true. That old version of Mae had to die in order for me to be able to survive. Because the old version of Mae needed my husband to live because we intended to spend the rest of our lives together. And that version could not survive without him because it was so tightly knit together with the idea of being with him. So I think it's probably true for other people in some of their significant losses too, is that it's a loss of the person or the pet or whoever that you lost. And it's a loss of your idea and your identity that you shared with that person, right? And it's not an end, actually. It's a transformation of who you are going to be beyond that. But I didn't know that yet. I just felt like I died, like my life ended. I had this black port. Do you guys do that in your culture? Like here in Japan, they carry a portrait of the deceased in a black frame. Quite often they put it like, you know, on a huge easel at the funeral or, you know, that kind of a thing. So I have this like beautiful picture of him in a black frame. But in my mind and in my heart, I always have my picture, my portrait in a black frame right next to his at the same age at 37. And if I didn't have my two kids, I probably would have put it up in my living room right next to his. But I didn't for the sake of my kids, because I think that would be kind of over the top. But that was the feeling that I was going through on the inside, is that Mae died. And in light of that, there was also a clinging to life. Like I needed to eat, I needed to breathe, I needed to feed the children and nurse my baby, I needed to find a way to sleep, I needed to, you know, figure out a way for me to be alive. And so much of that was made possible for me because of the presence of my children too. The yoga was such an essential part of me feeling like, oh wait, I'm still here. I'm still alive. I can still take the next breath, and I will take the next breath. You know, so that I won't wither. So that's, I needed it more than ever. No?
Yeah, and you were able to, I guess, make that link and take the action to do that for yourself. You know, like I guess it's a form of self-care and self-preservation, which I guess maybe if you hadn't already had that practice, like for some people that might not have that existing practice that they do that's so life-giving for them, that, you know, they might not be able to take those actions to care for themselves in the same way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it would be harder to start something new than to just go back to something I had already been doing for 17 years or whatever, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I just realized, you know, that's why it's so important to start doing things that are good for your health and that are good for your, you know, mind and emotional health before anything happens, you know, that you have some tools, which, you know, for me as well, when I was 20 at the time when my mom died, I didn't have tools, although I had writing and singing, and I think that was that became my default way of processing. So it is interesting, actually. I didn't have other tools that people might normally lean on, but I had some tools that became my default. And I think that's what it is, that if you have some tools that you use to look after yourself and your health and your well-being, then they become what you go to, maybe.
Yes. And, you know, hearing you speak about that makes me realize that for some people, that tool becomes the nearest thing that they've done anyway, which a lot of times it's drinking. Sometimes it's substance abuse. Sometimes it's going around and sleeping with people. And, you know, sometimes it's cutting or whatever it is that's like near to you. And it's not that thing suddenly comes up for you. It's that the tendency was always there. And then in light of the shock and in light of the loss, it becomes your next available thing. So it can go both ways. You can have these healthier self-care techniques kind of in place, you know, whether it's journaling or the yoga or breathing or taking a walk or having a pet or whatever it is, versus the whole myriad of other things that people do, right?
That are self-destructive and unhealthy.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, that's I hadn't really thought about that until now. Just those the coping tools that you have will be whatever you've practiced before a major loss, becomes your default way of
Yeah.
coping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What a huge realization.
And I know that you are, I guess, in the process of publishing a memoir about your
Yeah.
grief journey, and it's called Kizuki. Is that
That's
right?
right. That's right.
Have I pronounced it right?
Yes, you have.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And can you and I know that there are four concepts in that book that you kind of speak to. Yeah, can you share a bit about those concepts and how they've helped you along the way?
Yes. So writing has been one of my old loves too, and it's interesting because all everything that I've ever published has been in Japanese. But suddenly, after the loss of my husband, um, there was something deeper. There was something more emotive that needed to be expressed through me, and it came in the form of this book, which is a memoir about my experience through grief. But as we've been talking about, more importantly, it's a story of my metamorphosis of identity because I'm not the same person I used to be anymore. And so the key question, like the self inquiry that popped up for me that I would love to share with everyone is this question: how will you let grief change you? And I think that change factor is so pivotal because it's easy to let grief swallow you. It's easy to let grief stomp all over you. It's easy to let grief ruin your life. But if you let it change you, then that's when it opens you to a future, to a reality that you hadn't been able to imagine for yourself before. Now, I didn't have that in place to begin with, but through my writing, these kind of concepts started to come through me. And so my story, The Metamorphosis of Identity, is comprised through the four main concepts, which are kind of like this arc of life that we all go through, which I refer to as tsunami, Kizuki, cocoon, and Selah. The first one, tsunami, is the tidal wave. But it's like the tidal waves in my life, the ones that have swallowed me whole, turned me upside down, put me in darkness. I didn't know which way was up. I didn't even know if I was going to survive. So those are the tsunamis. But my idea is that through and after each tsunami, there has been a Kizuki. And Kizuki is the Japanese word for realization or epiphany. It's the moment of becoming aware of something that you had formerly been unaware of. But once you realize something, you can't go back and unrealize it because you've already seen it. You're already aware of it, And in that way, it unfolds your consciousness to a greater evolution, to greater awareness. So you can't go back to who you used to be before you knew that thing. And so my theory is that after every tsunami, then the gift comes in the form of these Kizukis. And then, not necessarily in sequential order, by the way. Sometimes they just all jumble up, happen together, And some are incremental, and then some are like sudden epiphanies, And then cocoon is my word for the time to delve deep within and allow yourself to metamorphosize, because you need that sacred space to be untouched by the stirring sounds of life as you knew it before, to allow yourself to go that deep. Because the wholeness of your energy is going through this reformation, And so you kind of need that cocoon. So cocoon is my sacred space. of silence, of beingness. And it's, as it is sacred to me, it's sacred to you, and it's sacred to anybody going through any significant change. You leave them untouched. You don't probe at them, you know? And then the final word, Selah, is a word that I never even knew that just popped into my world, but it's a Hebrew word, actually. Apparently, it's mentioned 74 times in the book of Psalms or something. But and Selah is not clearly defined in dictionary terms, but it's surmised that Selah refers to a pause, a moment of silence following recognition of a meaningful delivery of intent. It could be music, it can be writing, it can be some form of expression. But when that thing is expressed and it's complete, it's there in fullness, then there is that moment of silence, that sizzle that follows. And sometimes I like to quote Michael Jackson in that old documentary, This Is It. There's a scene in there where he goes, you know, because he's like a phenom, right? Obviously. There's a scene in there where he's in rehearsals and he's leading his band and he's leading the keyboardist to play this tune. And then it goes, and then all the musicians go boop. And then, you know, at once they play the note and then they have this moment of shared silence. And then the keyboardist plays the next note and Michael Jackson goes, no, 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 no. No, too early, too soon. Like, leave the silence. He goes, let it steep in the silence, bathe in the moonlight, he says. So I love that expression. It's the ineffable that is brought into form, and we give it its due honor in the moment of Selah. You know, so those are the four the kind of concepts that I weave through in my book.
Wow, I love that. It sort of beautifully describes the process through these different metaphors. Yeah, the process of change and, you know, just transformation. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. And I've really enjoyed having this conversation, and I can see that I guess you've just done so much work, and the yoga and meditation has kind of, you know, been that steady foundation, it seems like, you know, for all to come back to life and to live again and to do this meaningful work. For anyone who maybe I guess hasn't, do you recommend yoga and meditation for people that are grieving and that haven't done so yet? Can yoga and meditation be a way for people to start finding their own way through?
Yeah. What I wholeheartedly recommend is for people to just take that, or even use that time of grief as a sacred time. You know, it's a sacred time to go within and find a deeper connection with yourself. And so the yoga and the meditation, they just become one of many tools out there. It can be yoga or meditation or anything else, but I do recommend getting in touch with your breath. You know, the mindfulness teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, it's so simple. It's so simple that it just goes over our heads, but he says, breathing in, I know I am breathing in. Breathing out, I know I am breathing out. And that's all he says. And for most of us living our busy lives, it just goes right over our heads. But if you're, you know, grieving, or if you're going through a time of tremendous change and you're wanting to be in touch with who you truly are, I recommend going back to what you absolutely know to be true. You know you exist. You know you are here. You know you are aware. You know you are breathing in. You know you are breathing out. You know you are alive today. And then eventually, you know you're hungry now, or you know you need to sleep now, or you know you are depressed now. But then you know what's transient versus what stays. And it's I think it's a lifesaver, for me too, when you're having super depressive thoughts and when you're having suicidal thoughts or whatever, to know that's just a thought, one of thousands of thoughts. And to know that that's transient, no matter how hard it is, to know that that's transient versus I know that I know. The fact that you are aware, that stays. That doesn't change. And if you could just spend a little time there, if you could just stay with that, I think that can be a lifesaver and a life changer and so many of these critical moments that we survive through.
So there's so much wisdom in that, I think. And before we finish up, I just wanted to ask, I guess, do you think there was any unique, I guess, having young children at the time, was there any kind of unique challenges that came with that, having to grieve, and then also take care of your children? Is there any advice or any tools that were particularly useful in terms of dealing with that, like for any mums or dads that,
Yeah. Gosh, that's such an important question. As any mom or any dad knows, when you have little ones that you're taking care of, quite often you end up like on a day-to-day level prioritizing them and their needs, and your needs get put on the back burner, so to speak. So even in my grief, in the initial days, I mean, I was completely wiped out. So there's that. But even as I began to gather the pieces, and I think it took me months before I could even go grocery shopping again and things like that. But, I would prioritize getting up in the morning and making breakfast for the kids and making sure the older boy goes to school, and then I drop the little one in daycare and things like that. And so I had to almost like I had to set my grief aside, and I know that that's one way to cope. But I also, in my experience, know that that's not, you can't really continue that in the long run. At some point it catches up with you, right? So the thing that really, really, really helped me is that I learned to ask for help. I mean, like basic things short of, can you please wipe my butt in the toilet, right? I didn't do that, but pretty much everything else, it was like, oh, can you buy these groceries for me? Can you get the milk? Would you mind picking up my son from school or from the bus stop? Or can you pick up these diapers for my baby? Or I don't feel like running the laundry today, but there's a huge pile there. Like anything and everything. I learned to ask. And in a sense, that was kind of hard for me because I wasn't really used to doing that. I had learned to be so self-dependent. But in light of the grief, I didn't have any pride, So it was like, oh yeah, please do this, please do that. And I didn't care anymore. I didn't care how people folded the laundry or how, what detergent they used. It was like, whatever,
As long as it's done.
Yeah, so long as it's done. And so maybe for some people that comes easier than for others. But the plus of that is that, like I said, when I mentioned my friends in India and Nepal, that grief can be a communal thing. It brought the community back to my life and to my home. It brought the community back to my laundry pile. It's like, now 5 years later, after my husband's passing, I don't mind if you want to do my laundry, go right on ahead. Like I don't have any pride about that. And so, yeah, I think the understanding that to receive help can also be a joy for the one who's giving that help. It really brought that sense of community and love back for me. So I hope that can help some people.
Oh, I love that. I think it will, yeah. Because especially for people who are very independent and, yeah, as you said, like, self-sufficient. And if you're not used to asking for help or receiving help, it can be quite challenging to start.
Yeah.
Even if you really need it, it still takes a bit of extra courage to ask.
Yeah.
So,
And like, especially in my culture, a lot of people, including myself, think that it's a bother. They think that if you ask someone for help, or if you're grieving, or if you're isolated, or if your child is having a tantrum, you think that you're bothering others in society.
or like it's a
Now,
burden.
on what? Yeah, like it's a burden. In Japanese, the word is meiwaku. It's like bothersome, right? And while on one level, like on a societal level, that may be true, my Indian friends, from the place in South India that I spent so much time, my Indian friends, they told me that from a young age in India, they are taught that human beings are human beings. You're supposed to be a burden on others, which is why we help each other.
Wow.
And when I heard that, it was such a perspective shifter, and it just takes the load. It just takes the burden off of your own shoulders to try to not be a burden on somebody else. And they're just like, oh yeah, we're all human. So that's how it goes,
Yeah.
And I love that.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. And it just shows, like the different things in different cultures, how you can kind of learn from other countries and cultures and kind of apply that wherever you are.
Yeah.
And obviously it takes, a support network as well. It takes people around you that are responsive to that, that are there to actually, jump in and help. So
Yeah.
it's really awesome. Thanks for sharing that. So yeah, if anyone wants to, I guess, I know the book's not out yet, but it's coming. But if anyone wants to, I guess, learn more about your work or hear about the book when it's out, where can they go?
Yeah, please find me on Instagram. My Instagram handle is MaeYoshikawa. And you can visit me at my website. It's maey.live, where there's more information about my book.
Awesome. And I'll put those links in the show in the description as well.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you for this conversation. I think it will be really helpful for a lot of people. And thanks for being so generous with sharing your experiences and story as well.
Oh, Gabby, I'm, in awe of the way that you give of yourself and the way that you make this kind of conversation available to the public too. So thank you so much for who you are and for the work that you do.
Thank you. If you found this conversation valuable, then it would be great if you could leave a review or share it with a friend so that more people can find this podcast. Thanks for listening.